Hello everyone, Assalamu alaikum. I hope you're doing fine. I welcome you all in today's session. In this session, I'm going to talk about cultural identity and diaspora. This is a theory that is given by Stuart Hall, who is a famous Jamaican British theorist, and his work is on Marxism as well. But here he talks at length about the theory of diaspora. He, as we know, comes from African background, and the cultural practices and forms of representations have the black subjects at their center and putting the issue of cultural identity in question. So, in this essay, he talks about cinematic representation in the third cinema. In the third cinema, that is the representative of Caribbean culture and Caribbean values and tradition, but in that particular culture, in that particular representation, the question of identity comes at the forefront, and then we see that who is this emergent new subject of the cinema, from where does he she speak. Practices of representation always implicate the position from which we speak or write, the position of enunciation. What recent theories of enunciation suggest is that though we speak so to say in our own name of ourselves and from our own experience, nevertheless, who speaks and the subject who is spoken of are never identical, never exactly in the same place. Identity is not as transparent or unproblematic as we think. Perhaps instead of thinking of identity as an already accomplished fact which the new cultural practices then represent, we should think instead of identity as a production which is never complete, always in process, always constituted within, not outside representation. This view problematizes the very authority and authenticity to which we term cultural identity. And in this session, we are going to talk about how black identity is situated, or how black identity is still kept intact by the people of black origin, people of African origin, and when they go, what kind of encounter do they find with the colonial culture and the European background, and as a result, the kind of ambivalence that they feel and the kind of third space that they go into, and where a new identity is transformed, which is considered or called as hybrid identity. So, in the first point, Stuart Hall writes about black, or writes as he says, of course, the I who writes here must also be thought of as itself enunciated. We all write and speak from a particular place and time, from a history and culture which is specific. What we say is always in context, positioned. I was born into and spent my childhood and adolescence in Jamaica or in African background, where we see that he talks about his own personal background, his own family background. I have lived all my adult life in England, in the shadow of the black diaspora, in the belly of the beast. So here, the belly of the beast, he is calling it to the empire which colonized his motherland. I write against the background of a lifetime's work in cultural studies. If the paper seems preoccupied with the diasporic experience and its narrative of displacement, it is worth remembering that all discourse is placed and the hurt has its reason. So here you can see the first position that he defines is the cultural identity in terms of one shared culture, a sort of collective, one true self, hiding inside and the many other more superficial, artificially imposed self which people with a shared history, ancestry hold in common. So, in this first definition, he is going to talk about the one code, the one shared historical experience with the people with stable, unchanging, and continuous frames of reference and meaning beneath the shifting division and vicissitudes of our actual history. The oneness underlying all the other more superficial difference is truth, the essence of Caribbeanness, the black experience. It is this identity which Caribbean or black diaspora must discover, excavate, bring to light, and express through cinematic representation. So, the first type of identity is the native identity, is the identity of his motherland, is the identity of his ancestral land, and is the identity of his own childhood or his personal background to which he came. So it continues to be very powerful and creative force in emergent forms of representation amongst marginalized people in post colonial society. Rediscovery of this identity is often the object of what Fanon's once called as passionate research directed by the secret hope of discovering beyond the misery of today, beyond self contempt, resignation, and abjuration, some very beautiful and splendid era whose existence rehabilitates us both in regard to ourselves and in regard to other. So here Fanon in his on background in the white skin and the black mask, and in the other book the wretched of the earth, in both these books also talks about how the personal background, how the individual background coming from a particular culture uh, focuses on his on past or recent past. As Fanon again says, col- colonization is not satisfied merely with holding people in its grip and emptying the native's brain of all form and content by a kind of perverted logic. It turns to the past of oppressed people and distorts, disfigures, and destroys. So, here, this point I would like to highlight where Fanon is of the view that colonization does worse to the history and distorts the historical places, historical countries, historical cultural background, such as we can see in the time of colonization, how Muslim historical background was distorted, how Mughals were portrayed as of having no morality, no codes, no ethics. Similarly, we can see that colonization did same to the other people as well. One such book, A Passage to India, written by E.M. Foster, who was also one of the representative of a colony, also describes similar experiences in his book when he creates very distorted images of India and like the first line of the first chapter indicates the very truth that what colonial representative wanted to tell us, except for the Marabar caves, and they are 20 miles off. The city of Chandrapur presents nothing extraordinary. So here, nothing extraordinary is given to the city of Chandrapur, as together the washed by the river Ganges, it tails a couple of miles along the banks, and then the streets are mean, the temples ineffective, and though a few fine houses exist, they are hidden away in the garden down the alleys, whose filth deterrs all but the invited guests. So here you can see that how Chandrapur is represented as of having no significance, no value, no worth, whereas the place inland that was in under the control of the English people, how there is an owl maiden, a long swallow hospital, houses belonging to Eurasian stand on high ground by the railway station, beyond the railway station. So here you can see that how parallel counter reality is constructed, which gives a kind of a very significant cultural image to the places that were owned by the white colonial people, whereas the uh, individuals or the areas or the places that belong to the Indian people, they were misrepresented. Similarly, Rudyard Kipling's also the white man's burden can be seen as one such representative. Other representatives can also be seen like Shakespeare's The Tempest, or many other Dante's Inferno, or later on you can see that the post 9/11 fiction also represents the similar type of stereotyping and misrepresentation, where history is distorted and disfigured, as is suggested by Fanon, that is the role of colonization. So here it is also the matter of unearthing that which the colonial experience buried and overlaid, bringing to light the hidden continues, it's suppressed, or it is quite different then practice entailed not the rediscovery but the production of identity, not an identity grounded in the archaeology but in the retelling of the past. So, colonial retells the past but in his own way, in his own manners, and in his own wording, which surely entails stereotyping as far as natives are concerned. Hidden histories have played a critical role in the emergence of many of the most important social movements of our time: feminist, anti colonial, anti racist. So, there you can see that how these movements were countered. Crucially, such images affect a way of imposing an imaginary coherence on the experience of dispersal and fragmentation, which is the history of all enforced diaspora. They do this by representing of or figuring Africa as the mother of these different civilizations. This triangle is, after all, centered in Africa. Africa is the name of the missing term, the great aporia, which lies in the center of our cultural identity and gives it a meaning which until recently it lacked. No one who looks at these textual images now in the light of the history of transportation, slavery, migration can fail to understand how the rift of separation, the loss of identity, which has been integral to the Caribbean experience, only begins to be healed when these forgotten connections are once more set in place. So, in order to heal, you have to go back to the history, you have to set the narratives, and you have to settle the scores, and you have to retell the stories in the manner of the liking of the native people, where native people are respected and their wounds are healed. For instance, we can see the similar thing is done by Alice Walker in The Temple of My Familiar, or Maya Angelou in her poetry, and similarly Toni Morrison in her novels, when they represent African American slave experiences, and such texts and restore an imaginary fullness or plentitude to set against the broken rubric of our past. They are resources of resistance and identity with which to confront the fragmented and pathological ways in which the experience has been reconstructed within the dominant regimes of cinematic and visual representation of the West. So here you can take the example of similar text, which is Born a Crime by Trevor Noah, where he represents the hybrid character and his own childhood and the life of the separation in apartheid time in South Africa. So you can see, and that is a beautiful read as well. Cultural identity in this second sense is a matter of becoming as well as of being. It belongs to the future as much as to the past. It is not something which already exists, transcending place, time, history, and culture. Cultural identities come from somewhere, have histories, but like everything which is historical, that they undergo construct transformation. Far from being eternally fixed in some essentialized past, they are subject so to the continuous play of history, culture, and power. Likewise, you can see that how the ways in which black people, black experiences were positioned and subjected in the dominant regimes of representation were the effects of a critical exercise of cultural power and normalization, not only in Said's orientalized or orientalist sense were we constructed as different and other within the categories of knowledge of the West by those regimes. They had the power to make us see and experience ourselves as other. Likewise, you can see the similar things happening in this particular novel, Passage to India, where you can see that how we people of colonial background, people of African background are considered as misrepresented, considered as having no sense. For instance, the first appearance or first representation of Dr. Aziz, he was a doctor, a medical doctor, but you see the first line, the way he was represented, abandoning his bicycle, which fell before a servant could catch it. The young man sprang up on the veranda. He was all animation. Hamidullah, Hamidullah, I am late, he cried. Don't apologize, said his host, you are always late. So you can see that how the kind of stereotypical image was given to Dr. Aziz, as he was represented as habitual latecomer, and he couldn't even park his bicycle within proper manner or proper experience. So this is why you can see that how when the West or the Western writers create the people of the Eastern background, and they create these characters, they create these individuals as the others, not as the part of that particular society in which they belong and they have any kind of prestige or respect. So every regime of representation is a regime of power, framed as Foucault reminds us by the fatal couplet power knowledge. But this kind of knowledge is internal, not external. It is one thing to position a subject or a set of peoples as the other of dominant discourse. So here you can see that how people of Eastern background or African background, they become the individual or they become the victim of that particular type of power knowledge couplet where power is exercised upon the individuals and how knowledge is constructed or constituted, and they become the victim of epistemic violence that Bhabha call is Homi ke Bhabha, and then who calls it a kind of epistemic violence, a kind of misrepresentation, a kind of representation that is not suited according to the culture, values, and tradition. So it is quite another thing to subject them that to that knowledge not only as a matter of imposed will and dominance by the power of inner compulsion and subjective conformation to the norm. This is the lesson, the somber majesty of finance insight into colonizing experience in black skin, white mask, where finance highlights all the issues, all the ways in which the colonized individuals are subjugated to further colonization by the power practices utilized by the colonizer. This inner this inner expropriation of cultural identity cripples and deforms if its silences are not resisted. They produce in finance vivid phrase individuals without an anchor, without his horizon, colorless, stateless, rootless, and a race of angels. So here when people of our culture, people of Eastern culture are represented, when we are misrepresented, when we are created as individuals without history, without color, without horizon, without any kind of the background, so we become rootless, we become stateless, and we become a cosmopolitan individual or a global citizen. But that global citizen doesn't have the kind of the root, doesn't have the kind of identity. The otherness as an inner compulsion changes our conception of cultural identity. In this perspective, cultural identity is not fixed essence at all, lying unchanged outside history and culture. It is not some universal and transcendental spirit inside us on which history has made no fundamental remark. So you can see that how we are created, we are constructed, and we are constituted without our roots, without our histories in the literature of the colonized individuals, literature that is created by the colonizers. It has its histories, and then you can see it is something return of the, of course, is not a mere phantasm either. It is something, not a mere trick of imagination. It has its histories, and histories have their real material and symbolic effects. The past continues to speak to us, but it no longer addresses us as simple factual past, since our relation to it, like the child's relation to the mother, is always already after the break. It is always constructed through memory, fantasy, narrative, and myth. Cultural identity are the points of identification, the unstable points of identification, or such which are made with the discourses of history and culture, not an essence but a positioning. So here positionings are very important. This was the first point. The second point, and the cultural identity, if identity does not proceed in a straight unbroken line from some fixed origin, how are we to understand its formation? We might think of Black Caribbean identities as framed by two axes or vectors simultaneously operative, the vector of similarity and continuity, the vector of difference and rupture. So these two identities that are thought of or that are considered of having two opposite values. They are dialogic in nature. They have a kind of dialogic relationship between these two axes and the kind of binaries that they are. As a result, the one gives us some grounding in some continuity with the past. The second reminds us that we share is precisely the experience of a profound discontinuity. The peoples are dragged into slavery, transportation, and colonization. Migration come predominantly from Africa, and where that supply ended, it was temporarily refreshed by the indentured labor from the Asian subcontinent. This neglected the fact explains why, when you visit Guyana and Trinidad, you see symbolically inscribed in the faces of their peoples the paradoxical truth of the Christopher Columbus's mistake. You can find Asia by selling west if you know where to look. So here you can see that how Christopher Columbus, who is considered as a kind of evil person by the Native Americans, and the cause of the root evil or the founder of the slavery, and how in his in his written letters that he writes in 1492 to the King Ferdinand and the Queen Isabella of Spain, where he truly misrepresents the Native American culture and the native people, and how he misrepresents. So there are these traumatic reptiles to match these enforced separations from Africa, already figured in the European imaginary as the dark continent. So here you can see that how European people created the kind of individuals who were misrepresented and who were having of no value, no significance, no past, no history. This paradox that it was the uprooting of slavery and transportation and the insertion into plantation economy as well as symbolic economy of the Western world that unified these peoples across their differences. Here the writer is talking about the European people. They're talking about that how European people united themselves, and then even despite having their differences or their disagreements. So we belong to marginalized, the underdeveloped, and the periphery, the other. So here the all the individuals who come from the non-white background are all outsiders, and they are at the rim, at the edge of the metropolitan world. And here you can see that is why otherness is created, that is how the identity is shaped, and that is why the common history, transportation, slavery has been profoundly formatted. So here this writer goes on talking about the further discussion related to how these individuals of uh, European background created the colonized individuals, and where he talks about difference and deference by Derrida, that created the kind of individuals through language and through discourse, and they were misrepresented at in the larger scenario as well. So here I would also like to talk about the next idea, where you can see the writer talks about that it was only in the 1970s that Afro Caribbean identity that was formed became historically available to the great majority of the Jamaican people of home and abroad. In this historical moment, Jamaican people discovered themselves to be black, and then sons and the daughters of the slavery, and how they identified themselves to their own cultural background. It could only be thought that the impact of the life and the post-colonial revolution, the civil rights struggles, and the culture of then Pharinism, and the music of reggae, the metaphors, the figures, and or signifiers of the new construction of Jamaicanness. So the kind of identity that emerged in 1970, similarly in black art movements, where you can see that how in America the same cultural awakeness or cultural awareness was created, where black, brown, mulatto, white all look at the present African, in fact, to speak in the name, and they just consider themselves as the original Africans, and no longer, and then they saw that how they have been transformed. History is in that sense irreversible, and then you could see that how the temporal disfigurement was realized, and how the identity and culture was ransacked by through having some kind of connection. So here the writer also gives the concept of imagined communities that was given by Benedict Anderson, and who is of the opinion that how it has or human values or human traditions and human culture is a kind of a fragile thing, and kind of, because it is a kind of imagined or figurative value, where imagination unites people, and that is why various things that are taken into consideration while uniting people, such as patriotism, is propagated time and again by the patriots in order to show, or in order to tell that how individuals of a particular native background could be grouped or could be united. So, what of the second troubling term is the identity equation, the European presence. For many of us, this is a matter not of too little but of too much, where Africa was a case of unspoken, Europe was a case that which endlessly speaking us, the representative of the native culture, how we or people of African or Asian background was represented by the European people, by European individuals. The European presence interrupts the innocence of the whole discourse of difference in the Caribbean by introducing the question of power. Europe belongs irrevocably to the play of the power, to the lines of the force and consent, the role of dominant in Caribbean culture. So here the second point, the most important point, where the writer talks about the European role of power and exposes the power hierarchy that belong to European culture, and how poverty and racism of color represented the African people, and the European presence is that which is usual representation has positioned the black subject within its dominant regimes of representation, the colonial discourse, the literatures of adventures and exploration, the romance of the exotic, ethnographic, traveling eye, the tropical languages of tourism, travel, brochure, Hollywood, and violent, and then pornographic languages of Genga and urban violence. So you can see that when you look at the post colonial representation, when you look at the post colonial writings, and how those post colonial writings represented the people of the Eastern background, when you start looking at it from the perspective of Dante or from Shakespeare, or later on, you can see that. How all these European writers who created black characters such as Joseph Conrad or E.M. Foster or Rudyard Kipling, and later on post 9/11 fiction, they kind of created all these exotic images of the ethnographic Eastern or African background. So, your presence, European, is about exclusion, imposition, and expropriation. We are often tempted to look at that power as a wholly external to us, as extrinsic force whose influence can be thrown off like the serpent sheds its skin. But no, it's not like the case. It can't be easily shaken. Reaching to the pre colonization or decolonization stage is extremely hard. So, what Frantz Fanon reminds us in Black Skin, White Mask, how he says the moment, the attitudes, the glances of the glances of the other fixed me there, in the sense in which a chemical solution is fixed by a dye. I was indignant. I demanded an explanation. Nothing happened. I burst apart. Now fragments have been put together again by another cell. So he was into pieces. The other fixes us and the places of the other, not only by violence, hostility, aggression, but in the ambivalence of the desire. This ambivalence is extremely important. It is the forgetful stage. It is the stage where third space occurs. It is the stage where individual loses his glorified connection to the past, to his own history, to his own culture, rather goes into a kind of state where he doesn't have this kind of belief system in his values and traditions. So, this brings us face to face not simply with the dominating European presence as the site or the scene of integration, where those other presence which it had actively aggregated were recomposed, reframed, and doubling what Homi K. Bhabha has called ambivalent identification of the racist world. So here otherness is created, and how people are marginalized, how people are sidelined, or how people are treated as of having no value, no tradition, no culture. So the enigma is impossible so far as to resolve. It requires most complex of the cultural strategies. Think of the, you can see that how you think of the dialogue of every Caribbean filmmaker or writer one way or the another, and the dominant cinematic representation or literature of the West, and the complex relationship of the young black and the British filmmakers. You can see the third, new world presence. So in the first one we had already seen that how the connection to the past is created and then distorted, and how European second in the second stage achieves power, and in the third space new world presence is not much power, us, ground, place, territory. So you can see that as far as these things are concerned, so there is no much power. It is juncture point where many cultural tributaries meet the empty land. The European colonies emptied it, and where strangers from every other part of the globe collided. None of the people who now occupy the islands, black, brown, white, African, European, American, Spanish, French, Eastern Chinese, or so on. It is a space where creolization, assimilation, and then synchronization or syncretism were negotiated. The new world is the third term, the primal scene where the fateful fatal encounter was staged between Africa and the West. So here you can see that it is the signifier of imagination of itself, traveling, voyaging, and return to the fate of destiny, and then Antillean as the prototype of the modern and postmodern New World. Nomad, continually moving between center and periphery. So these cultures, these diasporic individuals, they are called as nomads, or they are called as individuals having no identity, individuals belonging to no land, individuals belonging to no identity, and individuals struggling on all front, and then they are considered as a kind of sly, or they are considered as of having no value, no tradition, no culture. And then in the last point that I would like to conclude over here, you can see that this on this particular note, where you can see that in this highlighted section we have been trying we have been trying to theorize identity as constituted not outside but within representation, and hence of cinema as not as the second order of the mirror and held up to inflect and what already exists, but that type of the representation which is able to constitute us as new kinds of subject, thereby enable us to discover places from which to speak. Communities, Benedict Anderson argues, in imagined communities are to be distinguished not by their falsity, not by their falsity or genuineness, but by the style in which they are imagined. So, this is how we can see how we are identified, how we are considered as a kind of individual to a kind of culture, and then this particular quote sums up all by Benedict Anderson. Not by Benedict Anderson, but by Fanon, and where he says, we must not therefore be content with delving into the past of a people in order to find coherent elements which will counteract colonialism's attempt to falsify or harm a national culture is not a folklore nor an abstract populism that believes it can discover the people's true nature. A national culture is as a whole body of efforts made by a people in the sphere of thought to describe, justify, praise the action through which the people has created itself and keeps itself into existence. So here in this 15 point, Fanon concludes that what is the way forward for existence, what is the way forward where to describe, to justify and praise the action through which we can be constituted. So here in this particular session we talked about three main areas. First one was related to the connectivity of the past, and second one was related to the connection of the European and how European identity and background and European colonization played its role upon distancing the individuals of the black background into a kind of ambivalent stage, and where the Europeans assumed power and where they assumed superior space and relegated the people of African background to the position of marginality, and as a result those individuals created a third space for themselves in order to survive, but in order to do that they lost the roots, connections to the homeland, and as a result they were nowhere and had no identity, had no space and no cultural background. So this is the framework given by Stuart Hall related to cultural identity of diasporic people residing in diasporic lands or residing in as expatriate communities. So if you have any question related to these complex issues, you can reach me out through the comment section. Stay tuned, stay happy and stay blessed, and make others as happy and blessed.